last stragglers a couple of minutes to find their way into the webinar, and then we'll start. Thanks.
Dungeons and Dragons teller.
Oh, surely.
Yeah.
Yes, let us start now. Shreya, could you put the screen back on? Great, thanks. So welcome to this Agrarian Change seminar. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, University of London, and I'll be chairing this session in which Dr. Shapan Adnan will discuss the Rohingya peasantry of Myanmar, a limited case of agrarian change, disintegration by state violence, ethnic persecution, and land grabs. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Shreya Sinha from University of Cambridge and Enrique Castagnon from here from SOAS. The Agrarian Change seminar series is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. This year, the seminar series is, for obvious reasons, run as webinars, and you can find the full program of the series on our website, Agrarian Questions, which is aqs.org.uk. The webinar is also live streamed on YouTube. Before we start, here are some guidelines for participants. First, please keep your microphone off, except when you're contributing to the discussion. That increases the quality of the sound quality quite dramatically if you do so. Secondly, we hope that the webinar will be nicely interactive, so do write questions and comments in the chat at any point of time. This is also the case for those of you that are joining us through the YouTube live stream. There's a comments function on the YouTube live stream that you can use too. For the question and answer session that will follow the presentation, those in the webinar can also ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function, which you find if you click on the participant button at the bottom, and there you will then see that function pop up. And of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate. If you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. It is now time to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Shapan Adnan, who is a professional research associate here at SOAS. He did his PhD at Cambridge and went on to hold positions at, among other places, the University of Chittagong, the National University of Singapore, and a number of other organizations. He's a leading scholar of agrarian change in Bangladesh and has done extensive work among the indigenous population in the Chittagong Hill Tracts as well. At least he has worked on the Rohingyas of Myanmar more recently. It is my pleasure to welcome him today to present on the topic, the Rohingya Peasantry of Myanmar, a limiting case of agrarian change, disintegration by state violence, ethnic persecution, and land grabs. Shapan, you will have 45 to 50 minutes. After that, I will start at 45 minutes. I'll start interrupting you and saying there's 5 minutes left, etc. And after that, we will have a discussion. Over to you, Shapan. Shapan?
Shapan,
Okay.
you're still mute. Yeah.
It's not muted at my end.
No, you're fine now. We can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Can everyone see the slides?
I can see them, certainly.
Very well. Let me start then. Welcome everyone to this webinar. The talk okay. Let me begin by simply setting the scene. We're going to talk about the Rohingya peasantry in Arakan state of Myanmar. Arakan has been renamed as Rakhine state, but Rakhine also refers to an ethnic group. So to avoid confusion, I'm going to use Arakan, and I'm also going to use Burma in place of Myanmar from time to time. Now, the central issue that I'm addressing is what are the factors underlying the persecution and expulsion of the Rohingya peasantry from Myanmar, and also the nature of associated agrarian changes. To begin with, just to set the scene, the demographic composition is such that the Rakhines are Buddhists, and they constitute the majority group in Arakan. The Rohingyas are part of the Arakanese Muslims, who are the minority in that region. The Rohingyas are the largest of the Arakanese Muslim groups. In terms of settlement patterns, Rakhine and Rohingya peasantry live side by side in adjoining villages. They have common occupations that characterize the peasantry, so fishing, crop cultivation predominate, family-run businesses, and some wage work. In terms of social relations, the Rohingyas are subordinate to the ethnic Buddhist groups through clientelist ties and relationships, as well as being subject to control by the Myanmar state and security forces. So this is the geographical context. You can see Myanmar on the western side of Myanmar. You have the red shaded area, which is Rohingya, the Arakan belt, Arakan state, and of course you can see Bangladesh to the northwest. So this is the framework, spatial framework in which the processes that I'm going to talk about have taken place. Now, just to help, without going to much detail, I've just put up a timeline of key events and processes. And as you will see, it goes far back to 1784, when Arakan was joined to Burma for the first time. Before that, it was an independent kingdom. And then you see a sequence of things which I'm not going to go through, but note that in 1942, the Japanese conquered Arakan, which was then under British Burma, and that Burma becomes independent in 1948. In 1982, the Constitution of Myanmar excludes Rohingyas from the list of the 135 national races that qualify for citizenship rights. And over this entire period, beginning from 1977, there are repeated expulsions of the Rohingyas to Bangladesh. Again, I'm not going to go through the details, but note that in 2012, there is a major Rakhine-Rohingya communal conflict, which is a turning point in terms of a critical rupture in everyday relations of coexistence between these two groups. From 212 onwards, one begins to get a reaction in terms of the resistance organization, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army,
it is run by,
also known as Harka al-Yaqin. In 2016, ARSA conducts a raid, which is followed by brutal counterinsurgency operations against the Rohingya civilian population. On 25th August 2017, there's a bigger raid by ARSA on security forces, which is followed by unprecedented brutal clearance operations, which leads to the expulsion of more than 700,000 Rohingyas to Bangladesh. From 2018 onwards, there is the emergence of a new conflict between the Myanmar military and the rebel Arakan army, which is a Buddhist Rakhine rebel organization. And the last phase, in 2019, November and December, a case is lodged against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, charging it with genocide of the Rohingyas. In January this year, the ICJ orders provisional measures which ask Myanmar to restrain itself from genocidal acts against the Rohingyas, from destroying evidence of such violence, pending the eventual ruling of the court on the case. In May this year, the first progress report is submitted by Myanmar, and in October this month, Gambia, which is the plaintiff, submits the case documents to the International Court of Justice. So that's the background. Now, the outcome of this whole sequence of events, and particularly the violence and persecution of Rohingyas, is that the majority have been expelled, with over 1 million in Bangladesh, and ironically, in the ones in the Rohingyas who still remain in Myanmar are minority. They are about 600,000, and 1/5 of them are in internal camps or internment camps. The destroyed Rohingya villages have been systematically bulldozed. New constructions have been built upon them, and I'll show this later on, erasing evidence of previous habitation. And Rohingya farmlands have been taken over by state agencies, private companies, and ethnic Buddhist groups. So this is this map shows you the kind of scattering of the Rohingyas from Myanmar, and you can see that the numbers in Myanmar are a minority compared to the Rohingyas who are abroad. And this is what I would describe later as disintegration of the Rohingya peasantry. Now, what are the key questions that I'm trying to address? Well, first of all, what are distinctive features of agrarian change? Whether we can accommodate this within existing frameworks of agrarian transition, for example, features of the differentiation of the peasantry, primitive accumulation, possible capitalist reconstitution. How has the labor of the Rohingyas been deployed after being dispossessed? And what kind of changes have occurred in property rights and production relations? And not least, how has the idea of development been used in these processes? Moving on to determinants of agrarian change in the Arakan, which has affected the Rohingyas. What are the antecedent factors which have been driving these processes of exclusion and change? In particular, what are the roles that have been played by state violence, ethnic persecution, land grabs, displacement, and expulsion? And then at the end of the talk, I hope to review some of the explanations of the factors of change affecting the Rohingya peasantry. There is the official Myanmar narrative, which I will discuss. Then there is the hypothesis is that land grabs are the primary motive of expulsion of Rohingyas. And this is advanced by scholars like Saskia Sassen and others. And lastly, I will try to put forward the elements of an alternative explanation. In terms of the methods, I obviously didn't have first-hand access to Arakan state of Myanmar for first-hand data collection. So, but I did have primary data collected through group discussions and interviews among Rohingyas inside and outside refugee camps in Bangladesh and key informants. I used secondary sources in terms of reports, some of which were based on first-hand data collection. For example, the ones commissioned by the government of Myanmar, the one led by Kofi Annan, and the other, the Independent Commission of Inquiry. I've used evidence from there, which are based on first-hand data collection, and also the UN reports by the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and also the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, which had to collect their data from second-hand, so to speak, from refugees in Bangladesh. So moving on now to the actual processes of change. The first process that we want to look at are the legal and administrative means of denying property rights. As I noted earlier, this constitution doesn't allow anyone that does not belong to one of the national races to be a citizen. And if you're not a citizen, you cannot own land. Now, one of the laws that have made things difficult is the Vacant, Fallow, and Virgin Lands Management Act, where it is stipulated that no one can apply for a permit to hold land unless they're a member of the recognized national races. For the Rohingyas, that is obviously difficult, and particularly because in Rakhine State, 42% of the land area actually falls under that categorization. So one sees how legal changes have restructured property rights, creating the potential for legalized land grabs, dispossessing Rohingyas. And it also shows how interlinkages between laws and the constitutional provisions on citizenship serve to reinforce the threat of land loss for Rohingyas. A second device is the National Verification Card, or NVC in short. NVC is an identity document, and the thing is that in order to get it, the applicant has to say that, in the case of Bengalis, that he or she is a in the case of Rohingyas, they have to write on the application form that they are Bengalis. But obviously, if they write that, it means that they're admitting they're not part of the national races and therefore cannot become citizens of the country. So for these reasons, Rohingyas are very wary of accepting the NVCs, but many have had that thrust upon them, and which has in a sense disqualified them from having access to land. As I will discuss later, the NVC is a multi-purpose tool and has been used to impose other kinds of restrictions on Rohingyas and their livelihoods. This is a picture of the form of the NVC, and it's in Burmese language, but there are English translations, and you can see points where it asks for the ethnic origins. And here is a poster posted by the Burmese government in the refugee camps, which says, only if you hold a NVC will you prosper, and so on. So moving on from the NVC, there are the processes of confiscation of land and standing crops. As Rohingyas were expelled during the latest waves of violence, they left behind their lands, in some cases with standing crops. What happened was that in many cases, these lands, the crops were taken over by the military and a number of other organizations. Among these were various farmers associations belonging to Buddhist Rakhine groups, and an organization called the Union Enterprise for Humanitarian Resettlement and Development, UEHRD, or in short, Union Enterprise. Now, this is a private public entity, and it is chaired by none other than the state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi. these businesses to which the union enterprise allocates work, like crop cutting, are crony companies which are typically owned by the military leadership and their friends and family members. And such crony companies are given favored access to contracts and subsequently provide donations to the military and the union enterprise. Now, moving on to the disposal of grabbed Rohingya lands as contrasted to crops, what has happened is, in some cases, Rohingya lands have been simply given over to Rakhines and other ethnic groups, which are also peasant groups. So if you look at that as a whole, the process does not lead to any qualitative changes in the relations of production in peasant farming and fisheries. But what it does is that it replaces one kind of agent, Rohingyas, by another. There are some changes in class structure because there are clientelist linkages between Rohingya fishermen and farmers with Rakhine patrons, trader money lenders, and obviously as there is replacement of Rohingyas by Rakhines, there are those changes in the class structure. Now, deployment of Rohingya lands for cultivation or construction by crony companies. Just as with standing crops, the lands of the Rohingyas are farmed out through the union enterprise to Burmese crony capitalists, which take over those lands and are charged with either making new constructions or operating those lands. So the confiscated Rohingya lands utilized for new construction for security forces and state agencies like the police and the border guard police, as well as model villages, are in fact taken out of production. And here you see some pictures of satellite images which show the situation before and after. And there are dates on the left-hand side, for example, is in this slide is 23rd November 2018. The right-hand slide is 2nd April 2019. And the slide shows the changes that have taken place in terms of new constructions. This is another example where you have changes, and these are marked by the square boxes with arrows. And this is a third picture where you can see those sort of gleaming dust red colored structures, which are new in Rohingya villages. So what are the outcomes of these government policies? First of all, there is primitive accumulation in the sense of the confiscation and transfer of Rohingya lands to various social groups and agencies, which corresponds to primitive accumulation in the sense coined by Marx, as contrasted to harvest accumulation by dispossession, which is more in the context of neoliberal policies, financialization, finding outlets for the overaccumulation of capital. These, I think, correspond much more to Marx's original notion of primitive accumulation. In terms of the relations of production, the lands taken over by private companies have been either used for profit-oriented agriculture, including commercial plantations. So one can think of these as agricultural capitalism of the crony variety. However, the areas given to Rakhines and other ethnic groups obviously do not involve a change in the relations of production or the form of production as such. But what that does actually lead to is a kind of demographic engineering whereby in the ethno-demographic composition of Arakan state, Rakhines replace Rohingyas in the agrarian structure. And obviously, the deployment of Rohingya lands and construction of facilities for the security forces constitutes investment in the coercive apparatus of the state rather than production as such. If you look at the role of the union enterprise and its development programs, it's A purported objective was to provide humanitarian assistance to affected populations and facilitate the return of Rohingya refugees. In practice, it has not fulfilled any of those roles. Rather, it has taken away the remaining lands and standing crops of the Rohingyas and made it even more difficult for them to return from Bangladesh. Now, although shared by Suu Kyi, the actual role of the Union enterprise has been to harvest and left behind by the Rohingyas and also take over their lands and give it over to crony capitalists or the security forces. So this is all done in the name of development. And this is very much part of the government of Myanmar's discourse. And we see here a fairly familiar example of the notion of development being manipulated as a deceptive cover for discriminatory actions. And to note, in contrast to some other types of land grabs that I'll discuss in a minute, these land grabs were specifically targeted at the Rohingyas as an ethno-religious group whose very presence was not wanted by the Myanmar state and social forces. Now, in contrast to the ones that I've discussed so far, there is the state acquisition for large-scale projects. Now, this is a different kind of land grab which takes place for establishment of special economic zones, a deep sea port, oil and gas pipelines in southern Rakhine, near the port town of Phu, and so on. So these are major infrastructure and standalone projects. And these have been primarily financed by foreign investors, external governments, as well as transnational corporations. And these are typically involved production with wage labor, embodying capitalist relations of production. However, there are concerns about the absence of employment opportunities for local people like ethnic Rakhines because of the practice of bringing in foreign workers by the concerned foreign investors. In this case, I think one can say that these land grabs correspond much more to Harvey's notion of accumulation by dispossession, insofar as they're driven by neoliberal policies to provide sites of investment or over-accumulated capital. Unlike the instances noted above, the seizure of lands by large-scale foreign investments are not specially directed at the Rohingyas and could have also affected Rakhines and other groups of the Arakan. So this is the context to which Saskia Sassen's arguments apply in terms of the role of land grabs in the Arakan, which I will discuss later. Moving on from land grabs, let's look at restrictions on movements and access to livelihoods. This again is very detailed, and I'll just summarize. There are arbitrary and discriminatory restrictions against Rohingyas imposed through a variety of mechanisms like local orders, NVC conditionalities, verbal instructions, curfews, and so on. And they restrict Rohingyas from accessing not just land, but fishing and open access and common property water bodies, foraging in forests for bamboo, timber, and so on. They require travel permits. There are dawn-to-door curfews which limit the working day and which also impede work in seasonal peaks like fishing in particular times of the year. And there are also ethnic pressures where Rohingyas are also prevented by opposition from fellow Rakhines from accessing certain kinds of livelihoods. The NVC I've mentioned before, this document, this slide simply elaborates what are the things that not having an NVC prevents Rohingyas from doing. It also shows that even with an NVC, they do not have full access. Rohingyas who refuse to accept NVC are threatened with violence, destruction of their homesteads. This is nothing imaginary. There is evidence to show that the last round of counterinsurgency operations in 2017 was preceded by pressure on Rohingya villages and intimidation to accept the NVC. And they were threatened that if they didn't accept it, there would be retaliation, and that indeed take place. There is also forced labor, and this is where the Burmese military picks up people and makes them guard their camps, do their portering, clear the lands, do building and construction works. The conditions are horrific. Men, women, and children are made to work. There is insufficient or low quality food or none at all, and sometimes they have to arrange their own food. If they're unwilling to work, they get beaten up, physically assaulted, arrested, even killed. In some cases, the security forces extort money from the forced laborers to set them free. So in contrast to wage workers under capitalism, these Rohingyas were slave-like, unfree workers from whom labor as well as money was extracted by the captured employers. And forced labor has been a key factor contributing to the fleeing of Rohingya men and boys from Myanmar. You can think of that as another kind of mechanism of primitive accumulation. Lastly, let's look at the IDP camps where 120,000, 1/5 of the Rohingyas in Myanmar stand. These are extraordinarily cramped and unhealthy, unhygienic places. They're subject to draconian restrictions, the extreme case of restrictions where they're not allowed to move and are only given permission to move if they pay bribes to their guards and so on. The Rohingyas in IDP camps are subject to restrictions that prevent or limit them from livelihood options, and in that sense results in food insecurity and malnourishment. And this will be important when I come to discuss structural violence in a while. So as an overview, these restrictions have created prohibitive barriers for Muslim businesses and laborers from entering the economy. This is from the Kofi Annan report. And restrictions on the Rohingyas have increased incentives for engaging in illicit commercial activities. It has nurtured a culture of unproductive rent-seeking, and they have serious adverse effects on Rohingyas, leading to lack of food security, malnutrition for children, and it also leads to communal segregation insofar as Rohingyas are kept forced to stay as far as possible in their own villages or in the internment camps. There is no everyday mixing with other groups like the Buddhists. So to take a look at the condition of labor and livelihoods of Rohingyas in Myanmar, the Rohingyas are not wanted as a desired population group by the Myanmar government or dominant Buddhist social organizations. And so just summarizing what has happened, what I've said before, to conclude in this slide, the existential conditions of the remaining Rohingyas in Myanmar systematically constrain them from working as free wage labor and hence impeach the form of a working class among them. Given these varied constraints, it is not surprising that Rohingyas in villages and camps in Myanmar have become extremely dependent on external assistance. And faced with these limiting conditions, Rohingyas have tried to find ways to escape to other countries, overland to Thailand, or by boat to Malaysia or to Bangladesh. And these processes have particularly detrimental effects on Rohingya women, whether as self-employed or wage workers, as trafficked sex slaves under conditions of surveillance and predatory violence. The longer the Rohingyas have to stay in refugee camps, abroad or in guarded villages, the more irreversible becomes the social and demographic shifts forcibly imposed upon them. Now, having discussed land and production relations, and also the conditions of labor. Let's put those two together and see what are the changes in agrarian production relations in Arakan state of Myanmar. First of all, even though there was some degree of inequality among the Rohingyas, further differentiation through market interaction or demographic partitioning was foreclosed by the systematic use of structural and direct violence to exterminate or expel them from Myanmar. Instead, there was a state-orchestrated primitive accumulation through land grabs in the settlements, which evicted the Rohingya peasantry en masse. Land grabs of Rohingyas by various mechanisms has been a key process of primitive accumulation and also accumulation by dispossession. And I've discussed the different contexts where the two concepts might be applied. One additional idea is that the denial of rights of access to common property or to state resources such as fishing grounds and forests also serve to separate concerned occupational groups from their means of production. And therefore, these also amount to a kind of primitive accumulation based on anticipatory exclusion. Other kinds of mechanism that I discussed also contribute to primitive accumulation, the multi-purpose NVC, forced labor. And so the combined outcome of these different processes has been to level almost all entire Rohingya peasantry to destitution, a kind of aggregate downward shift as contrasted to polarization resulting from differentiation of the peasantry. And this is indicative of a limiting case of the differentiation of the peasantry, in which all classes are reduced to the same level, irrespective of their prior conditions. Thirdly, the interlocking grid of restrictions on Rohingyas imposed serves to operate as a kind of structure, as a kind of framework for structural violence, which limits their access to essential needs for survival. And this is combined with the fact that they are also unable to go to places of work. There are systematic constraints which prevent the emergence of wage workers. On the other hand, the kind of capitalism which has emerged is the kind of the crony variety. It's not subject to the rules of market competition for survival, but good relations of the top brass of the Burmese military. So what we have is a kind of complex enmeshing of mechanisms which provide the framework for structural violence, violence which is not visible and direct, but which nonetheless has the same kind of effects. It operates through manifold restrictions on Rohingyas, constricts their access to resources, literally starves them, and this also gives content to the notion of genocidal intent, which is also crucially being debated in the court at the International Court of Justice. To paraphrase Tanya Lee, it is not simply a case of let die, but also make die, going beyond simply delinking Rohingyas from the means of production and subsistence. Now I move on to the explanations of agrarian change and disintegration of the peasantry. And there are three subheads to this, which I will go through in sequence. Now, firstly, the official Myanmar narrative. I'll just pick up the key elements of the Myanmar official case. The key claim is that the Rohingyas are illegal immigrants to Arakan state of Myanmar. Now, there's a long history of the presence of Arakanese Muslims and their predecessors who were in Arakan well before the arrival of Burmans from central Burma. If we recall that 1824 was when Arakan was annexed to the central Burman Empire for the first time, it is evident that Arakanese Muslims had been living in that region for several centuries before that. Secondly, the bulk of immigration from British colonial India took place prior to partition and also prior to the separation of Burma from British India in 1937. In other words, when the actual labor migration took place, there were no international borders defining what is legal or illegal migration. That simply was not relevant. And it is therefore not warranted to kind of say retrospectively that those who migrated there during the British colonial period crossed borders illegally and are therefore illegal migrants. A second plank of the Myanmar case is, official case, is that the violent clearance operations in 2016 and 17 were justified as responses to raids by the Rohingya rebel organization ARSA. First of all, there is evidence to show that threats and intimidation of Rohingyas took place prior to the raid by ARSA on 25th August 2017. In addition to documentary reports that I have used, I also have first-hand testimonies of witnesses who were in Myanmar villages at that time before 25th August, who have given detailed descriptions of the way they were threatened and intimidated prior to that raid by the Burmese military. Now, the refusal to accept the NVC was a crucial motive, followed by punitive violence to remove them by extermination or expulsion. There was prior planning and preparation by the military in terms of a meeting with the state councillor Suu Kyi and bringing in reinforcements in the weeks before the ARSA raid of 25 August 2017. And not least, there were 3 meetings for donation to fund the military for its operations in Arakan state, which took place in September 2017. The first meeting took place on 1st of September. If you think that the ARSA raid was conducted on the 25th of August, the military was moving in for donations from its trolley companies within 1 week of that. And there were 2 other meetings within the same month. So what this is suggestive of is that there was prior planning to this whole process. Moving on to the land grab explanation by Saskia Sassin and others, this is a good effort to balance explanations of expulsion of Rohingyas, which focus on ethno-religious persecution, by adding additional imperatives of land grabs in Arakan state. And to this end, Saskin points out that favorable large-scale legal changes have taken place which favor large-scale corporate acquisitions, and that there has been a growth in land grabs since the entry and resurgence of foreign investment. She also argues that by far larger numbers of Buddhist smallholders have been expelled compared to Rohingya smallholders. In particular, she points to the massive Chinese investment in a strategic deep sea port in Kiakpu and adjoining areas, arguing that this might have encouraged the military to expel the Rohingyas from economic development. Specifically, she points to the destruction of Rohingya villages in northern Arakan as evidence of support for a thesis based on initial Chinese investment in southern Arakan. Now, before I move on to the critique, here are some maps. This map shows on the top northwest is the northern Arakan districts where the Rohingyas are concentrated. In the middle, just a second. Yeah. This is Kiakpu. This is where the deep sea port and the special economic zone is being built. These are the areas from here where the destruction of Rohingya villages take place. And you can see that there is a considerable distance between the Chinese investments and the destruction of Rohingya villages. And this other map also shows this, makes the same point. Here is Cube True, and this is the place for the deep sea port, the oil and gas pipelines, which run from this port through Burma to China to Kunming. But the land grabs that we're talking about here in Arakan state are not proximate to the ones, the area where these infrastructure investments have taken place. So to provide a critique of Sasan's explanation, let's just go through this. The main point is that while her broad brush strokes do make a good point, they do not accurately explain the processes which have actually taken place in Arakan state. The predominant victim of land grabs in Arakan have not been Buddhist smallholders, but Rohingya peasants of all classes, not just smallholders. She does not explain how the strategic interest of China in investing in deep sea ports in southern Arakan, she doesn't explain how that translates into processes by which the military benefits by destroying Rohingya villages. As I've noted, it is nearly 140 kilometers away from the sites of Chinese investment. And in any case, in terms of the argument, state acquisition of land for development projects could have been made in the Rohingya villages without having to kill or expel them from the countries. And it's not necessary. And this argument from land grabs cannot also explain why there was general support among the Buddhist Rakhais of Arakan, and indeed the Buddhist majority of Myanmar generally, for the violent repression and expulsion of the Rohingyas. And lastly, land grabs cannot explain expulsion of landless Rohingyas, and landless Rohingyas constitute nearly half of the Rohingya population. And insofar as the land grab explanation is based on violence, direct violence, or state power, it does not take account of the role of restrictions and structural violence, which are much more diffuse. So those are the various reasons why the land grab explanation used crudely would not hold. I've shown these maps before, so let's move on towards an alternative explanation. And I think for that, we need to link land grabs with ethno-religious persecution and the framework of structural violence. This has been violent expulsion has been a feature from long on, from November 1948 to begin with. And these processes of land grabs well antedate the wave of land grabs which were triggered by the liberalization and the opening up of Burma to foreign investment. So primitive accumulation through land grabs in Arakan has taken two forms. Those for the large infrastructure projects which I've just discussed, those were not aimed at any particular ethnic group and probably dispossess both Rohingyas and Rakhines. And the second type of primitive accumulation are specifically targeted at the Rohingya villages. And this is not explained simply by general propensity for land grabs. This requires instead an historical understanding of the roots of antipathy towards Arakanese Muslims by ethnic Buddhist groups. And this goes back to the history of being on opposite sides of historical conflicts and processes of othering to which the Rohingyas have been subjected. To begin with, the Arakanese Muslims were formed into a militia by the British colonial government to oppose the Japanese advance, supported by the Burmese Independence Army, led by General Aung San Suu Kyi's father, and supported by Buddhist Rakhine forces. Arakanese Muslim groups attempted to become part of Pakistan, but were rejected. Nonetheless, this attempt made indelibly marked them as disloyal to the Burmese nation state under Buddhist Burman leadership. There has been a series of Rohingya insurgencies during the succeeding decades, which have not succeeded, which have failed to get independence or autonomy. But what it has done has been to alienate further the Rohingyas as a group that has been deemed to be disloyal to the Burmese nation state. In parallel, there have been this othering of the Rohingyas from mainstream Myanmar. It is the concatenation of this exclusionary process that congealed into the overriding political objective of the Burmese state to remove the Rohingyas altogether as citizens, producers, and workers. And this was attained by violent eviction, with forced reallocation of land to security forces and crony companies, with attempts to justify these as forms of development, to overcome the so-called root causes of inequality, as has been illustrated by the role of the union enterprise chaired by the state councillor. It is the convergence of ethnic persecution and state violence in Rohingyas, with grabbing of the lands by union enterprise and crony capitalists to fund the military, that provides an explanation that accords with the detailed ground-level features of the destruction of Rohingya villages and the grabbing of their lands. Of course, there are additional layers of explanation at the level of the nation state. I've not tried to go into this, nor is there time for it, but these include arbitrary inclusions and exclusions going into the formation of the colonial state of Burma and Bangladesh. Significantly, these are based not on naturally existing notions of the imagined community, but deliberately constructed ones that are continuously renegotiated with repeated reimagining of these communities used to alter the structure of the state and the notions of citizenship and statelessness. To conclude, we have here, in the case of the Rohingya peasantry of Myanmar, a limiting case of agrarian change. I pointed out, I'm just summarizing the points made, the differentiation of the peasantry was foreclosed, primitive accumulation processes used not only direct violence, but also structural violence through discriminatory laws, travel restrictions, denial of access, forced labor, confinement in IDP camps, systematic constraints on the emergence of free wage labor, and incapacitation, decimation of the labor force, deployment of grabbed Rohingya lands as the means of coercion through construction of security forces, barracks, and facilities, and to crony companies surviving by making donations to the military apparatus rather than making profit based on market competition. So this is the kind of capitalism, if development, if it can be termed as such, for the case of Arakan. Broader aspects of agrarian change. However, we should note that killing, expulsion, or confinement of the Rohingyas has not destroyed the peasantry of the Arakan state as a whole, because even though Rohingyas have been destroyed or decimated, their places have been taken up by other peasant groups like Buddhist Rakhines. Secondly, the agrarian changes affecting the Rohingya peasantry have been refracted through the prism of ethnic and religious identities and corresponding relations between Buddhist and Muslim communities. These ethno-religious dimensions are reflected in the specific processes of primitive accumulation and capitalist reconstitution that I've discussed above. And thirdly, the consequences of agrarian change in Myanmar and the resolution of the corresponding agrarian questions are not confined to Myanmar alone, but also other countries where dispossessed Rohingyas have fled for shelter. It is therefore necessary to go beyond an approach based on methodological nationalism in order to show the entire spectrum of agrarian change that has devolved from the expulsion of the Rohingya peasantry. I do not have time to go into that, but let me just point out that we need that broader framework of analysis. And finally, the future prospects of the Rohingya peasantry in Myanmar. The bulldozing and construction of new structures on Rohingya lands simply wipes out any evidence of Rohingya habitations at any time. The government of Myanmar can be expected to continue to insist on imposing NVCs on Rohingyas. If these conditions do not change, it's quite unlikely that most of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, Thailand, and elsewhere will be able to return to Myanmar. On the contrary, even the residual Rohingyas who still remain in Myanmar may eventually be forced to leave one way or the other. These conditions are suggestive of the onset of a terminal phase of long-term expulsion of the remaining Rohingyas from Myanmar as part of a final solution. On the basis of past experience, the Myanmar regime may be expected to bide its time for an opportune moment to launch one more round of violent expulsion of the residual Rohingya peasantry remaining in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Shapan. This was a very sobering presentation on a topic. I think you called it that was what was happening had genocidal intent. It wasn't it wasn't accumulation while letting people die. It was making people die. So it's a distressing story. Of course, it is also your presentation. I think both provided the evidence for that, but also went beyond that through the discussion of underlying reasons for that. Let me just say before I go into a brief comment on that, I think we all could hear what you said, but obviously the sound quality was not as ideal as it should be. And it is interesting because this is not a faraway transmission. This is from within the UK. Our last seminar was with Ramakumar from India, and so it just goes to show you never know when it comes to the quality of webinars. But we tried to deal with it before the presentation, and well, I could certainly hear your arguments and your presentation loud and clear. So apologies to everyone, but I think it worked nevertheless. Now the program of the webinar is, as always, that after the presentation we go more or less straight onto question and answers. You can either write a question in the chats or you can raise your hands and ask the question. And we hope people will also raise their hands because that gives a better dialogue than simply writing in the chat. But questions in the chat are, of course, very welcome as well. Now, if I should just kick off the question and answer session, if I understood you correctly, then could one go so far to say that you're arguing that the agrarian change and land grabs, crony capitalism that we are seeing as part of the genocidal intent, the dealing with the Rohingyas, getting rid of them in any way possible, that is not the primary reason for them being kicked out, that this has a history that goes back beyond the immediate phase of capitalism, that is based on, shall we say, the nationalist project of the Myanmar government. Now, but if that is the case, could one maybe also say that a nationalist project is a project for crony capitalism supported by Burmese nationalism, and in that sense, it is still connected. There is a reason why the government wishes to dominate the other peoples of Myanmar, and that has to do with the kind of crony capitalist nationalist projects that they are arguing. So while I take your point that it is not primarily to free up this particular land, there is a connection still. It is part of the same building of a particular kind of nationalist capitalism in Myanmar.
Very well. Do you want me to reply straight away?
Yes, please reply, and then we'll take other questions afterwards.
Well, I think that my argument is not that the fact of a historical perspective or a historical tradition of enmity and antipathy between the Rohingyas and the rest of the Burman Buddhist groups is the primary factor of what is happening today. But it is to say that that antipathy pre-exists from a long time before, well before the neoliberal period of opening up of Burma and the kind of land grabs that have ensued since then. And therefore, what I'm arguing for is a concatenation of the pre-existing primordial enmities with current capitalist grid, refracted not only through ethnic persecution and ethnic discrimination, but also the peculiar structure of capitalism in Burma, where the military controls allocation of land, extracts rent and kickbacks, etc. Now, that does not necessarily apply to the other parts of Burma. Burma has 135 different ethnic groups. And as you all know, there are conflicts going on all around Burma, in Shan State, in Kachin, and so on. So it is not the case that what is true of the Rohingya situation with Arakan applies to all those groups. In one critical difference is that the other groups are recognized nations. The Burmese military might have a fight with them, but it doesn't question their credentials as Burmese citizens. Whereas, as far as the Rohingyas are concerned, that they are simply beyond the pale. They're not even to be considered.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the floor is open for questions.
Maybe I can just read out a question that has come to me privately.
Yeah, please.
So I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but that Dieter Reinhardt from Heidelberg is asking, what impact has the Kaladan multimodal transit transport project financed by India and connecting SEZ with Mizoram, what impact has that had on Rakhine? I think that's what the question is.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dieter, for that question. There is not actually much evidence that I've come across on the specific impacts of the Kaladan project. You're right to say that it is part of the Indian investment in Rakhine state. And in addition to the Kaladan project area, India is also investing in the Sitwe port or Akia port. And so it is that entire conglomerate of investments. Now, I do not know whether this in itself has led to any incremental land grabs apart from what is necessary for the port area and the economic zones and so on. And so to my knowledge, there is no drastic impact in terms of land grabs apart from the routine evictions that always happens if you have a special economic zone set up. Just to go beyond that, what this means is that in geopolitical terms, this is India's way of having its connection to Arakan, and it is, if you like, a kind of counterploy to the Chinese links from the few ports further south with road links and transport links apart from the gas and oil pipelines, linking this to Kunming in southwest China. So in that sense, it reflects these kind of regional rivalries and competition between economic powers, which are also being played out in Arakan state of Myanmar.
Okay, thanks. Nabila, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Dr. Adnan. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a doctoral student in sociology at Brown University, and so I was especially heartened by your critique of Sasan. And I guess the question I want to ask, I've been thinking a lot about Burma as and this whole Rohingya expulsion on ethno-nationalist ground, but also for land grabs as kind of a settler colonial project. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the precise question there. Could you please try again?
So I've been thinking of this kind of melding of large-scale population displacement on ethno-nationalist ground, and also land grabs, which is like a very particular confluence of kind of techniques of state making as a settler colonial project. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, speaking generally, large-scale land grabs, which lead to large-scale population displacements, have been historically evinced in settler colonial histories. But does that apply to the context of Myanmar, which is what we are discussing? And I'm just trying to think very hard whether there are any parallels. There is no obvious colonial population displacements that I can think of under the British or under the Japanese, briefly speaking. Instead, what we have seen is not so much settler colonial projects, so population displacement, but huge projects which have taken place in the post-colonial period. For example, the Milestone Dam in North Burma, funded by China, has raised huge mass protests, leading eventually the Chinese to kind of back out of it because of the kind of popular resistance in terms of the impact. So one has examples of that, but by and large, the Burmese regime, using its ruthless military, has generally been able to suppress whatever instances there have been of large-scale protests to displacements and so on. So that I would say is an exceptional case, but I understand that there are perhaps resistance organizations growing in Burma, which may become much more assertive in the future.
Okay. Could you say a bit more, Shapan, about who benefits from the land grabs? Here I'm thinking of, so it's clear the crony capitalists do, but local farmers, local peasants, how do they take over land? Who takes over land? How much do we know about that?
One knows, broadly speaking, that Rohingya lands have been given away to Rakhine groups. One doesn't have much evidence, at least I haven't come across it, on the kind of class differentials between those who are the recipients of such land. Recently, I came across a report of small-scale ethnic Rakhines who were holding Rohingya lands near Sitwe, the the town of Sittwe. And they had been able to use this land since 2012 for their own benefit. Now, very recently, they were given an order by the local authorities to move out of that land because it was occupied Rohingya lands. And this is very paradoxical and very surprising in the context of what we know about Burma. But it possibly has to do with the fact that there is the International Court of Justice and its provisional measures, which says that no further genocidal acts, including deprivation of people of their livelihood, is to be done by Burma. And so local authorities trying to meet the ICJ requirements might have decided to undo the benefit given to Rakhine small. Beyond that, Jens, I do not have more information on the nature, the more detailed gradients of beneficiaries and disbeneficiaries.
And with regards to crony capitalist that takes over, I mean, how much is known about the details? Who takes over? What they take over?
Massive. There is a report by the independent fact-finding mission, a separate report on the financial benefits and financial transactions of the Burmese military, and it lists two major holding companies used by the military. If I remember rightly, one is MEHL and one is NEC. They all begin with Myanmar Economic something. And under each of these conglomerates, there are dozens of companies. Now, these companies are linked to major business houses in Burma, and they are part of the group which not only gets contracts but also indulges in very deliberate funding activities to the military. Each of the major conglomerates has a charitable arm, foundation, Bright Future Foundation, New Day Foundation, and all kinds of foundations which have the specific business of sharing so-called profits from these crony companies and presenting this to the top brass of the Burmese military on possessions. I mean, it's not possible now to give the names of all of them, but there is a detailed listing of over 100 companies, of domestic Burmese companies. In addition, there are foreign companies from virtually everybody. I mean, it's a list of who's who. All major economic regional powers are also investing in Burma. And some of them are not only investing, but also are selling arms to the military as well. There are about 15 countries which are listed in that context.
Okay, very sobering as well. Shreya, you have another couple of questions that have been sent to you.
Yes. So I'm just going to ask. So Suraj is asking, hi Shapan, can you please elaborate further how class relations changed in the Rakhine state after Rohingyas' planned elimination from the scene? As you at one point argued, it is more of a demographic engineering. So would you not then call it more or less similar class relations? Of course, accepting invasion of military crony capitalist relations that emerged there with SEZs and other foreign investments. The other question is from Eda. She's asking, today also Rakhine communities are displaced due to the armed conflict between AA and the Tatmadaw. Do you see this as a similar process of ensuring interests of nationalist crony capitalists in Arakan state, this time using Burmese ethnic identity versus Rakhine ethnic identity, or are there other factors as well?
Shapan.
Yes. I'm just thinking what, on the responses. First of all, Suraj, changes in class relations. It is in part demographic engineering, as I said, replacing agents but not class structures. However, I think that there is some change in the sense that prior to the eviction and expulsion of the Rohingyas, there were steady, stable clientelist relationships between Rohingya farmers, fishermen who traded in the market, who borrowed from the moneylenders in the bazaar, who were patrons of local powerful figures. Now, obviously, that part of the clientelist structure has been taken away, and this is not just this is not so much a class change, but a change in the trans-class structures which link people from lower classes or poorer classes to the richer groups. That certainly has changed significantly, and you might say that it has become more monopolistic in the sense that it's now only Rakhines and not Rohingyas who figure among the classes of landlords, moneylenders, traders. There has been that kind of change. Whether the crony capitalist relations have had an impact on the local class structure, I am not certain. There is no reason, if the lands taken away are of the Rohingyas, that will not impact upon the residual Rakhine population. So I don't think that there is change in that sense from these processes. There might be changes from other processes, but not here. On Ita's question on the conflict between the Arakan army and the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, it is whether it is similar or not. First of all, on the crony capitalism, I have not come across evidence that Rohingya Rakhine lands have been seized and given away to any other groups or given to the union enterprise to hand over to crony companies. I've seen evidence of destruction of Rakhine villages, and one must say that the Burmese army is quite impartial in the amount of brutality it inflicts, regardless of whether they're Rohingyas or Rakhine. So some of this counterinsurgency or clearance operations have been incredibly ruthless and are very reminiscent of what has happened with the Rakhine Muslims, with the Rohingya Muslims. But there is one interesting difference and an important difference in terms of the mechanisms of repression and its impact on gender relations. In the case of the Rohingyas, there has been large-scale rape and sexual assault of women. It has been used systematically as a weapon of war. Now, the Burmese army, despite all its other brutalities on the Rakhines, has not been charged with sexual assault and rape of Rakhine women. So it has been noted by the UN mission that it seems that the Burmese military are not out of control. If they're ordered, they can restrain themselves by desisting from certain acts of violence compared to others. Now what that means is that it means that in the case of the Rakhine, so far, the question of land being taken away and being deployed to cronies or anybody else has not become a significant factor as far as the evidence that I have. It has led to certain very extraordinary movements in a different sense. Faced with the brutality and firepower of the Burmese military, ethnic Rakhines and also ethnic Mro and Kumi groups from Rakhine and Chin state, adjoining Chin state where the conflict has spread over, have actually moved towards the Bangladesh border for refuge. And certainly the Arakan army itself has bases in the Bangladesh reserve forests on the border. But I understand also civilian groups which are fleeing from the attacks of the Burmese army are also moving in the same direction. So there are those but unprecedented changes in population movements which have been unleashed by that conflict.
Thank you. We have more questions. There's one on YouTube, and there's more questions sent directly to Shreya as well. Could we start with the YouTube maybe and go on to the others?
Yes, sure. So the YouTube question is from Mahashweta, who's asking, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. My question is, one, with such forced displacement arises a change in livelihood. How does that affect their social capital? And two, what are their coping mechanisms? Then we have a question from Shruti, who is saying, doesn't driving out landless Rohingya wage laborers go against the interest of the local capitalists? Wouldn't a shrinking of the labor force drive up wages? What has been the interaction between the Rakhine capitalists and the state? Dita has another comment / question. The SEZs of India and China will have a midterm impact on the development of the whole Rakhine state. Does the security force / crony companies have an interest in grabbing land or expulsion of Rohingyas to take part in this development? So this is, according to him, a reformulation of Sassen's argument, and he's asking if this is correct. Surabhi is asking, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, Shapan. I was wondering about your point on the landless Rohingyas subjected to the restrictions and structural violence. Could you please elaborate a bit on the nature of dispossession experienced by them? Also, what livelihoods they were engaged in before the land grab? Okay, should I just say the other question as well? And Shapan,
why don't you? And then we'll try to remember them all.
And I'll be a bit sneaky and put in one of my own. Karina is asking, would you say this censorship of the situation and the fact that anti-Muslim rhetoric powers a lot of political interests globally are too much to overcome in terms of the international community intervening? What steps do you believe are necessary to attract support? And just a small question from my side, which is, you kind of draw a contrast in your presentation, I think, between the kind of structural violence and the land grabs. And I just wondered if you saw the land grabs in continuum of the structural violence, if that's a moment in the structural violence, or do you see that as a separate phenomenon? So yeah, I will stop here, and then if I have more questions and we have more time, we can come back to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions. Let me try and see if I can answer them. It's not always possible to answer the questions that you get in context like this. The first one from YouTube, I forget the name of the person. It's about social capital and coping mechanisms. Now, insofar as social capital, what could social capital have meant for the Rohingyas? It would imply their relations with their neighboring Rakhine co-villagers. It would mean their linkages with the trader moneylender in the bazaar, who was a Rakhine, or the local political leader and administrator who tends to be ethnic Rakhines. Now, Rohingyas have always had a rather submissive clientelist role in Arakan, and so they have largely depended on these linkages, and social capital in that sense has been crucial for their survival. Now, once there is they are evicted and driven out, whether across the border or to IDP camps, all of that social capital is immediately sort of destroyed or made useless. There is no network where this can be used. If there has to be social capital, it has to be regrown, redeveloped in the new context. Now, I do not know whether the Rohingyas in the internment camps of Myanmar actually have any scope for social capital apart from having the kind of relationships that you get between prisoners and guards, where there is a certain give and take, but in a very asymmetrical and unequal relationship. Perhaps that is all that that is possible in the IDP camps inside Myanmar. But for the Rohingya refugees, particularly those in Bangladesh, what I see is that starting from a zero situation where they have no land and they have no citizenship rights and they have no right to work or even earn incomes to feed themselves and their families, they have succeeded in surviving. In addition to whatever food comes in through international charity, many Rohingyas have found patrons. They've had to sacrifice in certain ways, and these are their coping mechanisms. To answer your question, they've taken lower wages. They've done work that no local Bangladeshi would do under those conditions. They've faced job conditions which are much harder. They've gone into deep sea fishing. They've gone into the forest with logging crews. And by their loyalty, by coming back to these employers, because part of this work is seasonal, so they have to go away and return, by their loyalty and the cheapness, the low costs of their labor, they've actually found social capital networks which have sustained them. So much so that when they've been arrested by the police for as illegal immigrants and threatened with deportation, it is their employers or their trader moneylenders or their contractors who've gone to the police station, paid the necessary bribes, and got them out. So those have been the coping mechanisms that I have come across. With Shruti on wage labor, and yes, it is paradoxical, is it not, that by constraining the emergence of wage labor, one is actually not necessarily benefiting the economy as a whole. On the contrary, enlightened self-interest would require to evict the Rohingyas, but keep them in the labor force, make no work. But that is also not the case. And so the obvious logic of economic self-interest does not seem to be operating. And that kind of reinforces the argument that I've tried to put forward, that this is not an economic enlightened self-interest based process that we are seeing in Myanmar. On the contrary, it is a kind of viewed with genocidal intent, so much so that there is willingness to accept economic loss, if need be, to get rid of the Rohingyas. I think that, if one can put it in those terms. Dieter on special economic zones by India and China, whether the multiplier effect, if I understand you rightly, that is not just the physical area of the zones, but the fact that these will stimulate more industrialization, more employment, and therefore even Rohingya villages 150 kilometers away can also be grabbed in anticipation of the land being made available to crony capitalists. I don't know whether that argument actually works. There are good reasons why crony capitalists can get hold of Rohingya lands, but that has nothing to do with the kind of financial investment and special economic zones. If we look at the Indian experience and the work of and Indian scholars and also external scholars on Indians' special economic zones, one thing which is very striking is that these tend to be very, first of all, these do not generate a lot of employment. The employment, to the extent that there is employment, the workers are kind of much more literate and educated, and they're bussed in, as for example, for call centers and so on. So the local peasants who lose their lands do not actually benefit from that kind of investment. Secondly, evidence from various Indian SEZs show that those who receive compensation money, instead of investing it in productive work, put a lot of it into trading and money lending and buying more land, replacement land. And so if there is any multiplier effect to be expected from the Chinese and Indian SEZs in Burma, there is no reason to believe it will take the form of dynamic and expanding capitalism rather than buying more land through trade and money lending, as we have seen in the Indian context. I mean, this is other things being equal. We cannot necessarily assume data that kind of development will take place. There is this question from Shurovi on landless Rohingyas. I'm not sure I can recollect the entire question.
Yeah, I can just read it out for you again. So the landless, and there's another question on landless Rohingyas. So what was the nature of dispossession experienced by them, and what were the landless Rohingyas doing before the land grabs? And a kind of related question has come from Ranajit, who's asking also why the landless Rohingyas were being evicted and forced out from Arakan while the crony capitalists need the supply of labor at cheaper rates. So I think just if whatever you can say about landless Rohingyas, basically.
Okay, no, that's fine. What kind of dispossession did the landless Rohingyas suffer? Obviously, by definition, they didn't have land to lose, but they didn't have private lands, but they did have access to common fisheries. They had access to forests. These were not private property means of production, but they were either common property or state-owned or other kinds of open access resources. Whatever the legal status, property status of those means of production, they depended on those resources for their survival. In that sense, their kind of loss was not of private land, but loss of access to other kinds of surface area, spatial area like forests and rivers and the seas. And so in that sense, one could argue that that was also a kind of primitive accumulation. If we define primitive accumulation as a process which separates the direct producer from the means of production, well, this is what is happening here, except that the means of production are not privately owned land. In terms of what was their status before this, well, obviously, some of is the question as to why were the Rohingyas landless? In other words, did they have other more landed position or other kind of wealth before that? I suspect that this landlessness could have been simply a process of pre-existing peasant differentiation, to the extent that it had operated before this massive extermination and expulsion program came along. And so this could have been on the basis of market-based land alienation in terms of taking loans from trader money lenders, not being able to repay that. One study of Rohingya village, kind of more monographic study, suggests that such process could have been at work. On Ranojit's questions about where will the crony capitalists find their wage laborers if the Rohingyas are thrown out? First of all, many of these investments are such that they're not labor intensive investments which require a vast army of wage workers. And in that sense, it may have been possible for the local Buddhist groups to provide that labor. But even if that is not the case, even if Rohingya labor is needed, what I've already argued is there appears to be a political imperative which says that we do not want Rohingyas here. Even if we need laborers, as far as we are concerned, the Rohingya laborers are persona non grata. They have to be thrown out, either outside the country or put into IDP camps. I mean, if you look at the IDP camps, here are 120,000 Rohingyas who are kind of hemmed into these settlements without the right to go out and work. Even if there is demand for labor in agriculture all around, they are subject to restrictions. And all of that suggests that the structural violence in the form of manifold restrictions on the Rohingyas does not operate according to the logic of economic enlightened self-interest. And so in that sense, it's a good question, Ranojit, but it seems that whatever may be the labor shortage in Rakhine state, there is no consideration given to making use of the Rohingya labor, which is locked up in IDP camps. Karina's question on anti-Muslim rhetoric, and what can be done about that on a global scale. The anti-Muslim rhetoric in Myanmar, to begin with, is of course a phenomena much wider than what is seen or what I've discussed in Arakan state. It extends to Middle Burma, where there have been riots against Muslims, and it extends to the top levels of the political leadership of Burma. For example, you will notice that in Aung San Suu Kyi's parties, no nominations have been given to Muslims, or even if they have been, this has been disallowed by the concerned authorities. And this is reminiscent in a way of Uttar Pradesh, where there are no Muslim MLAs allowed. Now, in Burma, we have, of course, a very strong alliance between the Burmese military and political leadership and the extremely virulent Buddhist nationalist anti-Muslim forces in the form of the Mabatha movement and I think the other one is 999. These two different movements which have good relations with the politicians and good relations with the military. So in a sense, you have, if I can put it in Western terms, an alliance between the clergy, the state, and the military, combined together against Muslims as a common threat. Now, Muslims may not be angels, but the fact is that with whatever kind of good and bad there might be, here you have a state with a power structure which is absolutely determined not to give any space to Muslims as possible. In this, the extreme example of that is what we see in Arakan. That may not have been possible in Yangon or in Mandalay and other places, but certainly Muslims are under pressure. Now, what can we do about this in the context of global Islamophobia? I don't quite know how to answer that, but I draw your attention to a very interesting phenomena across the Bay of Bengal region. You see similar formation of Buddhist, right-wing Buddhist clergy in Sri Lanka too. And there are some elements of it also in Thailand. And so it is not just the case that this is happening in Burma. For whatever reasons, this kind of demonization of a particular religious group or a particular ethno-religious group appears to play into the rise of populist, ultra-nationalist religious movements in these Buddhist countries. And somehow these provide a unifying factor for forces which would otherwise not be together, which might be contesting with each other. I do not have an answer to the question about how we can cope with it globally, not in this context. And
Shapan, yes, Shapan, we haven't got much time left, so please do answer Shreya's question, and if there's any final comments you wish to say, do so as well, but please do so within a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Shreya's question is whether land grabs are part of structural violence, as part of a continuum, a moment, I think is what she said. I think not. And the whole concept of, well, first of all, those two are not opposed terms. The binary is the opposition between structural violence and direct or visible violence. Okay. Land grabs actually can be undertaken through both direct violence and structural violence, in direct and indirect ways. So there is no clear cut. These are cross-cutting concepts in some ways. In terms of the Burmese experience, I would say that you have what it teaches us, what I certainly learned, which I didn't realize before I began to work on the way the Rohingyas have been treated in Burma, is that primitive accumulation evolves in extraordinary ways that we don't even think about. There is, of course, visible land grabs by using state power, even private gunda power, and so on. But the way restrictions about where you can go at what time, whether there is a curfew that you must return home by, whether to access a particular kind of resource, you need to get permits. If in order to travel, you need to apply and wait weeks from the local gatekeepers. All of that has the effect of undermining the potential income and the potential livelihood requirements that can be met. And in that sense, lead people to situations where they are no longer able to hold on to their existing living conditions. And as I've tried to say before, that even, there are two examples to give. With fishing and forestry, what you have is a situation where people are denied access to resources, which one can think of as being convergent with the notion of primitive accumulation, even though it is not an example of direct land grabs with force. A second example is that of forced labor and people not being allowed to do wage work. Now, there is no land grabs as such from them, but simply because of those conditions, it has forced many Rohingya from Myanmar to leave the country. And leaving the country is tantamount to separating oneself from whatever means of production one has access to. It may not be land, it can be livestock, it can be property, all of that is gone. So there are these insidious ways that I've understood how structural violence works in ways to make primitive accumulation possible. So to conclude, I mean, the two basic concepts which have come up in this discussion for me and for which I tried to wrestle with is how to apply the notion of primitive accumulation and how we can link that to the notions of structural violence. Those are the two ideas which I think have been thrown out very forcefully in the analysis of the predicament and the living conditions of the Rohingya peasantry and their conditions of not only survival, but also their conditions of morbidity and conditions of death. It is extraordinary that here is a system, and this I suspect must exist in other genocidal contexts in the world, where economic self-interest of the ruling classes are overridden by their pathological hatred of a particular community, whether it's in Bosnia, whether it's in Cambodia, whether it's in Burma. And that, I think, also is a powerful antidote to attempts to reason in terms of economic self-interest in trying to explain what we see in these very difficult conditions of human survival.
Thank you, Shapan. I think I will leave that as the last comment. I will not seek to add to your summary there. That is, and thanks for presenting in both all the details of this genocidal move that is going on in Myanmar, and also for analyzing it and providing us with deeper understanding in that sense as well. Thanks to everyone who has asked questions, of course, and to everyone who attended. The seminar will also be available on YouTube afterwards on the Journal of Agrarian Change's YouTube site, and you can Google it and you can find. Let me also, before I close down for today, say that our next seminar will be next Wednesday on the 4th of November, same time, and Tanya Lee from the University of Toronto will talk on cooperations and development lessons from Indonesia's plantation zone. So we're staying in Asia, but with a somewhat different focus. And thank you for everyone, and goodbye for today. Thank you, Shapan.